He spent 8 years playing a doctor who patched people back together in the middle of a war. And now, at 87 years old, Mike Farrell is facing the one wound nothing in that career ever prepared him for. On August 22nd, in a private home in Los Angeles, surrounded by the people who loved her most, Shelley Fabares died at 82 after a brief illness. Her family, including her husband of more than 40 years, released a short statement calling her a source of love, strength, laughter, and comfort. 6 words that carry the weight of an entire lifetime. If you grew up watching a teenage girl belt out a #1 hit on a black and white television set, or fall for Elvis Presley on the big screen 3 separate times, or trade sharp-tongued jokes with Craig T. Nelson on a '90s sitcom, this loss is going to land somewhere personal. Stick around, because her story, and the marriage that carried her through the hardest chapters of her life, deserves to be told properly. Shelley Fabares was born Michelle and Marie Fabares on January 19, 1944, in Santa Monica, California, and it's fair to say show business found her almost before she could talk. She began acting as a small child, made her official television debut around age 10, and by her early teens, she was already sharing screen time with Annette Funicello in Walt Disney's Annette. Performing wasn't entirely foreign to her family either. Her aunt was Nanette Fabares, the Tony Award-winning stage and television star who spent years as a comic foil to Sid Caesar on live television. So Shelley grew up with the first-hand blueprint for exactly the kind of career that was about to find her. That career hit its first real gear in 1958, when a 14-year-old Fabares was cast as Mary Stone on the Donna Reed Show, the wholesome, endlessly likable daughter in one of the defining family sitcoms of its era. For the better part of 8 seasons, viewers across the country watched her grow up in real time, week after week, and by the early 60s, she wasn't just a rising actress anymore. She was a certified teen idol. Fan letters poured in by the sackful, the kind of adoration that turns a working performer into a cultural fixture almost overnight. And then, almost by accident, she became a pop star too. In 1962, her single Johnny Angel shot to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, eventually going gold. It's the song most people still associate with her name even now, decades later, the one that turned up on transistor radios in bedrooms across America and never really left. She followed it with more chart entries that same year, proving the first hit wasn't a fluke. There's a well-known story from a cast reunion years later where Fabares admitted she'd been nervous about a dance number on the show, and Donna Reed tried to put her at ease by joking that dancing, swimming, and acting were 3 things she personally couldn't do either, and yet there she was, doing all 3 for a living anyway. It's the kind of dry, self-aware humor that seemed to define how Fabares talked about her own career for the rest of her life, never precious about the fame, always a little amused by the absurdity of it. She kept working steadily through television's golden decades after leaving the Donna Reed Show in 1963, showing up in anthology and genre staples like The Twilight Zone, plus guest spots on shows like The Incredible Hulk, The Rockford Files, Fantasy Island, and The Love Boat. It was the kind of reliable, recurring presence that made her face familiar to households for generation after generation, whether or not casual viewers could always place exactly which show they knew her from first. But if there's one chapter of her career that fans keep coming back to, it's the 3 films she made opposite Elvis Presley: Girl Happy, Spin Out, and Clambake. That's more screen time with Elvis than any other leading lady in his filmography, and Fabares spoke about that friendship for the rest of her life, with a warmth that clearly never faded. She described meeting him on set for the first time as a strange, electric moment, the kind where a room simply changes the second someone walks into it. She was famously candid that despite what tabloids love to speculate, there was never a romance between them, just 2 working performers who genuinely liked each other without any of the complicated undertow that so often surrounded him. Over the years, she shared stories about the strange, overwhelming scale of the attention he drew everywhere he went, and she often said she never fully understood how anyone was supposed to survive that level of adoration for an entire lifetime. Fabares' career took another turn in the mid-70s and 80s, including a stint as the sharp-edged rival Francine Webster on the original One Day at a Time, a role that let her push against the sweet, good girl image audiences had known her for since childhood. Then, starting in 1989, she found what many consider her second signature role. Christine Armstrong, the independent, quick-witted wife of Craig T. Nelson's blustery college football coach on the long-running ABC sitcom Coach. The part earned her 2 Primetime Emmy nominations and introduced her to an entirely new generation of viewers who had no idea she'd once shared a marquee with Elvis Presley. Away from the cameras, Fabares' life took its own winding path. She married music producer Lou Adler in 1964, a marriage that ended in divorce years later. It was around 1970 that she first crossed paths with a young actor named Mike Farrell on a Los Angeles set. Nothing came of that meeting right away. Both of their lives moved in separate directions for years, through other marriages and other chapters, before the two of them eventually reconnected. Farrell, born in South St. Paul, Minnesota, and a former United States Marine before he ever set foot on a soundstage, had by then become one of the most recognizable faces on American television, playing the gentle, steady Captain B.J. Honeycutt on MAS*H for 8 of its 11 seasons, a performance that, alongside Alan Alda, helped anchor one of the most beloved shows in the history of the medium. Shelley Fabares and Mike Farrell married in 1984, and what followed was more than 4 decades together, a partnership that outlasted nearly everything else in either of their extraordinary careers. Farrell brought the same quiet steadiness to his personal life that he'd brought to his most famous role, spending more than 2 decades as president of the board of Death Penalty Focus, an organization dedicated to abolishing capital punishment, work he pursued through public speaking, writing, and lobbying for over 30 years. In interviews across the decades, the two of them described a relationship built on genuine partnership rather than performance. Fabares once said his humanitarian work had expanded her whole world, while Farrell credited her with keeping him grounded and, in his words, a lot more fun. It was the kind of long, low-key devotion that rarely makes headlines on its own, right up until a moment like this one forces the world to notice it. That devotion was tested seriously over the years by Fabares' health struggles, including a widely reported liver transplant she underwent around the turn of the millennium, a recovery she later described publicly as one of the most difficult stretches of her life, both physically and emotionally. She was open, in the interview she did give, about how survival doesn't always feel the way people expect it to, and about the strange, delayed emotional toll that comes after a body spends everything it is just to heal. She carried that same openness into how she talked about her mother, Elsa Fabares, who died from Alzheimer's disease in 1992. Fabares spoke about the disease publicly in the years that followed and lent her voice to raising awareness around it, turning a private family loss into something she was willing to discuss for the benefit of other families walking the same road. Even in recent years, long after stepping back from steady television work, Fabares and Farrell remained visible together, most notably through their continued support of Death Penalty Focus, showing up at events well into their 80s, still walking into rooms side by side. Just last year, the two of them sat down for a joint interview reflecting on their careers, including Farrell's memories of joining the MAS*H cast and finding his footing in an ensemble that had already become a family before he arrived. Photographs from public outings in the past couple of years show a couple that still looked, by every account, genuinely happy in each other's company, unbothered by cameras, holding hands, showing up for causes they cared about together rather than separately. The statement Fabares family released this past week didn't try to summarize 50 years of a career or 40 years of a marriage. It didn't need to. It described her plainly as a devoted wife, a cherished stepmother to Farrell's children Aaron and Michael, a daughter, sister, niece, aunt, and loyal friend, whose warmth, generosity, humor, and grace made a lasting difference in the lives of everyone who knew her. They said she had a remarkable ability to make people feel welcomed, valued, and cared for, and that despite the heartbreak of losing her, they remain profoundly grateful for the years they had with her. It's a short statement, but read against everything else we know about her: the singer, the actress, the friend to Elvis, the advocate, the wife who stood beside Mike Farrell through decades of triumphs and hospital rooms alike. It lands exactly as true as it sounds. For Mike Farrell, an actor who spent much of his career playing a man whose entire job was showing up for people in their worst moments, This is now a role with no script and no crew to lean on. What we do know is what his family chose to share with the world, that Shelley Fabares died surrounded by the people who loved her in her own home, with dignity, and that the man who'd been by her side for more than 40 years was one of them. For everyone who ever sang along to Johnny Angel, who watched her grow up on the Donna show, who laughed at her chemistry with Elvis Presley on the big screen, or who simply knew her as Christine on Coach, this is a moment to remember not just the roles, but the person behind them, someone who, by every account from the people who actually knew her, spent her career and her private life trying to make the people around her feel exactly as valued as her audience always felt watching her. To really understand why this loss is hitting so many people so hard, it helps to go back and look at just how long Shelley Fabares was already a fixture in American homes before most of us were even born. She wasn't a child star who flamed out after one big role. She was working consistently, in front of a camera, from the late 1940s all the way through the 2000s, which is an almost unheard-of span in an industry that chews through careers in a fraction of that time. By the time the Donna show ended its original run in 1966, Fabares had already spent close to a decade playing Mary Stone, on and off, since she periodically returned to the role even after officially leaving the cast in 1963 to chase other opportunities. Think about that for a second. An entire generation of American kids grew up watching one specific teenage girl on their family television set every single week, year after year, until she felt less like an actress and more like an actual member of the family sitting in the living room with them. And the music side of her career deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it genuinely could have been its own separate career entirely. Johnny Angel wasn't a novelty hit tied to her television fame. It was a legitimate cultural phenomenon, a #1 record that outsold plenty of songs by artists who did nothing but music. She followed it up with Johnny Loves Me and The Things We Did Last Summer that same year, both charting, both proving that audiences weren't just buying a song because they liked her on television. They genuinely liked her voice. She released full albums during this stretch too, at a moment when very few teenage actresses were also functioning as recording artists with actual chart success. It's worth remembering that this was happening at the exact same time she was still a minor filming a weekly network sitcom, which makes the workload she was carrying as a teenager honestly a little staggering by modern standards. Her run opposite Elvis Presley remains, for a huge portion of her fan base, the single most talked about stretch of her filmography, and for good reason. Girl Happy came first in 1965, then Spin Out in 1966, then Clambake in 1967. 3 films across 3 consecutive years, all while Elvis was still one of the single biggest entertainment figures on the planet. No other leading lady appeared opposite him that many times. Fabares talked for decades about what it was like to be inside that orbit, the sheer gravitational pull he had on every room he walked into, and the strange, almost impossible pressure of being one of the most famous men alive at a moment when audiences everywhere expected constant, unrelenting perfection from him. She described their working relationship as easy and genuinely friendly precisely because there was never any romantic tension between them, which by her own account made her something of a rarity among the women who worked alongside him. That friendship, by all accounts, stayed meaningful to her for the rest of her life, and she continued to speak about him warmly in interviews well into her later decades, long after most of Hollywood's Elvis-era stars had stopped giving interviews at all. After stepping away from teen stardom, Fabares didn't disappear. She simply shifted into the kind of steady, respected character work that keeps a career alive for decades. Her stint on the original One Day at a Time as Francine Webster gave her a chance to play something sharper and less wholesome than the image audiences had built around her since childhood, a nasty business rival written specifically to contrast with Bonnie Franklin's character. It's a role that doesn't get talked about nearly as much as her earlier or later work, but it mattered because it proved she could hold her own outside the sweetheart typecasting that could have easily boxed her in forever. Then came Coach in 1989, and with it, a genuine career resurgence, playing Christine Armstrong opposite Craig T. Nelson's blustery, lovable football coach character gave Fabares 2 Primetime Emmy nominations and introduced her, essentially from scratch, to a completely new generation of viewers who had grown up with none of the context of Johnny Angel or Elvis movies. For 8 seasons on Coach, she was simply the sharp, independent, funny woman holding her own against Nelson's larger-than-life character. And for a lot of 90s television audiences, that's the Shelley Fabares they knew first, with everything else being something they discovered later, almost like unlocking a second, earlier career hiding behind the one they already loved. Her guest and supporting work across the decades reads like a tour through the most memorable shows American television ever produced, from an appearance on The Twilight Zone during its original run, to episodes of The Incredible Hulk, The Rockford Files, Fantasy Island, Mork and Mindy, and The Love Boat. She also lent her voice to Superman, the animated series in the 1990s, voicing Martha Kent, notably alongside her own husband Mike Farrell, who voiced Jonathan Kent in the same series, giving fans a rare chance to actually hear the two of them performing together as an on-screen married couple, echoing the real one they'd already built off camera. Mike Farrell's own career, meanwhile, is just as layered as hers, even though most people only ever mention MASH. Before MASH, he'd already worked steadily through the 1960s, including a role in the CBS medical drama The Interns alongside Broderick Crawford, plus other television work throughout the decade. He joined MAS*H in its 4th season, stepping into an ensemble that had already become tightly bonded before he arrived, and in a recent joint interview with his wife, he spoke candidly about how uncertain he initially felt about whether that family-like atmosphere would actually welcome a newcomer the way it eventually did. He stayed for 8 seasons, playing Captain B.J. Honeycutt opposite Alan Alda's Hawkeye Pierce, and by the time the show wrapped in 1983, he had become one of the most recognizable and trusted faces on American television, known for bringing a quieter, gentler energy to a series that never shied away from the darker realities of war. What Farrell did after MAS*H says just as much about who he was as anything he did on camera. For more than 2 decades, he served as president of the board of directors for Death Penalty Focus, an organization committed to abolishing capital punishment through public education, political organizing, and coalition building, both domestically and internationally. He spent over 30 years speaking, writing, and lobbying on the issue, describing the work in past interviews as something that moved him deeply and repeatedly, sustained mostly by the people he met along the way, who kept fighting even when progress felt slow. Fabares stood beside him through decades of that work, and she once described his humanitarian focus as something that expanded her entire worldview, while he, in turn, credited her with keeping him grounded and, in his own words, making him considerably more fun. It's a small detail, but it says a lot about the actual texture of their marriage. Less a Hollywood pairing built for headlines, and more 2 people who genuinely shaped each other over 4 decades together. Even in very recent years, long after both of them had mostly stepped back from steady screen work, they kept showing up publicly together, almost always in support of death penalty focus events, still walking hand in hand well into their 80s. Photographs from these outings over the past couple of years show a couple that looked, by every visible measure, completely at ease with each other, unbothered by the cameras that occasionally caught them, still willing to wave at photographers and joke around in public the way people do when they've genuinely enjoyed each other's company for a very long time. Just months before her passing, the 2 of them sat down together for a joint interview, reflecting on their careers, memories of the industry, and their decades-long partnership, giving fans one of the last extended, on-record glimpses of them together as a couple. Fabares was also open, in the limited interviews she gave in her later years, about her mother Elsa's death from Alzheimer's disease in 1992, a loss that clearly stayed with her for the rest of her life. She spoke about it publicly at various points, using her own platform to raise awareness around a disease that, at the time her mother was diagnosed, doctors understood far less about than they do today. She also spoke candidly, when asked, about health struggles of her own later in life, including a liver transplant around the turn of the millennium, describing the recovery afterward as one of the most difficult and disorienting stretches she ever went through, both physically and emotionally. She wasn't someone who did a lot of press in her final decades, but when she did speak, she tended to speak honestly, without much interest in polishing the harder parts of her own story. The statement her family released this past week didn't try to capture 50 years of a career or 40 years of a marriage. In a handful of sentences, And it didn't need to. It described her as a devoted wife, a cherished stepmother to Farrell's children Aaron and Michael, a daughter, sister, niece, aunt, and loyal friend, whose warmth, generosity, humor, and grace made a lasting difference in the lives of everyone who knew her. They said she had a remarkable ability to make people feel welcomed, valued, and cared for, and that despite the